We started a series a few weeks back, and we're going to continue that this morning. Going to take a look at a different story that probably is familiar to most of us, but it never hurts to look at it again. It's probably one of the most dramatic stories in all of Scripture as to how God delivered His children. And I'm talking about a story in the book of Daniel. We will look at two in the book of Daniel over the next several weeks. We're going to be looking this morning primarily in Daniel chapter 3. If you'd like to turn in your Bibles to Daniel chapter 3. The backdrop for Daniel chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar had seen a metallic image, a metal man that had a head that was of gold, had chest and arms of silver, a stomach. The stomach and the thighs were of brass, the legs were of iron, and the feet were a mixture of iron and clay. And Nebuchadnezzar, if you look in Daniel 2 and verse 46 and 47, the great king of Babylon the Great by the name of Nebuchadnezzar. Verse 46, it says that Nebuchadnezzar of Daniel chapter 2 fell upon his face and worshipped Daniel and commanded that they should offer an oblation and sweet odors unto him. So Nebuchadnezzar fell flat on his face in a manner to worship Daniel, because Daniel had explained to Nebuchadnezzar what he had seen in his dream. And in verse 47 it says, "The king answered unto Daniel and said, Of a truth it is that your God is a God of gods, and a Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets, seeing thou couldest reveal this secret." So the greatest king on the face of the earth acknowledged that there was a greater king than himself. And after that, Daniel and his friends, as the end of Daniel chapter 2 tells us, Daniel and his friends were exalted to the highest positions in the Babylonian kingdom. Of course, Nebuchadnezzar only was above them. Now, in making an arrangement like that, with Daniel and his friends exalted to the highest positions, those wise men who had once been in those positions of authority, how do you think they felt as they saw Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, 4 young men from a conquered enemy, being exalted to those high positions in Babylon? They obviously had to take somebody's place, didn't they? And those men whose places Daniel and his friend had taken, they were furious. They were livid. They were jealous. They envied, and they would not allow that to go on. So the demoted wise men of Babylon, who saw Daniel and his friends exalted, they said, how? They schemed. They sat back and they said, how can we destroy those 4 young men? And so they schemed, and they planned, and they plotted to devise a mechanism to destroy Daniel and his friends. anytime. Now, had Daniel and his friends done anything inappropriate or wrong? Were they wrong in being exalted to those positions? No. They simply were qualified for those positions. Anytime somebody is put in a position like that, there are always going to be schemers and plotters who are going to say, I want my job back. And I'm going to have it back. Even if it means demolishing those people. And that's exactly what they did. And so what did they appeal to with the king Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon the Great? They had to appeal to something. And they knew that Nebuchadnezzar was a very proud man. And so they appealed to his pride. They said, Nebuchadnezzar, you saw an image in your dream that was of gold, silver, bronze, iron, and then a mixture of iron and clay. And the gold represented you, O king. But that dream that Daniel saw or interpreted stated that your great and mighty and wonderful kingdom would someday pass away. But, O king, you really should make a statue that is all of gold to show that your kingdom is going to last forever. Well, did that appeal to Nebuchadnezzar? Of course. He was an arrogant man. And anything that would exalt him and puff him up and make him look great and be great, he was all for it. So Daniel chapter 3 and verse 1 says, Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits, the breadth thereof 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. That statue was tall, wasn't it? It was big. Now, is that something that you do overnight? You don't create something like that in a pan, do you? That takes planning. It takes committees. It takes a process of time. And so there was going to be this magnificent, magnificent image, statue set up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Now, would Nebuchadnezzar do that just so he could go out and admire it and pay homage to it? No, he wouldn't do it that way, just like any king or leader. It says in verse 2 that Nebuchadnezzar the king sent to gather together the princes, the governors, the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, all the rulers of the provinces, to come to the dedication of the image which Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Now, lest we think we're just reading a nice story here this morning, Nebuchadnezzar was the head of a nation called Babylon, a kingdom called Babylon. Now, can you think of another gigantic kingdom that's going to be set up at the end of Earth's history? What is it called? What's it called? It's called Babylon the Great. In Revelation chapter 17, notice real quickly, Revelation chapter 17, verse 5, Revelation 17 and verse 5, talking about this impure woman in Revelation 17, it says, and upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. So we've got Babylon the Great. At the end of time, we had Babylon the Great in the 6th and 7th centuries. And who did Nebuchadnezzar the king gather together to honor the image that he had set up? He gathered together everybody, didn't he? He got the whole world on his team, on his side. He went to all the provinces, all the places where he ruled, and he ruled the large area of the Middle East, some Africa, I think he ruled Egypt. Obviously, he ruled Israel, what was left of it. So Nebuchadnezzar gathered together the judges. He got the Supreme Court on his side. He got the world financiers on his side. He got the World Bank. He got the Federal Reserve System. He got the international banking community on his side. He got the princes, so he got the senators. He got the House of Representatives. He got local representatives in government. He got them on his side. He got the state governors on his side. He got the captains in the army. So he got the army on his side. He got the navy. He got the there wasn't an air force back then. But he got all of the military aspects that were available to him. They all got on his side. And he said, I want all of you to come to this place to honor me and the statue that I have set up. Babylon the Great today has done the same thing, hasn't it? Babylon the Great has control, as Revelation 17 and 18 tell us. They control the kings of the earth, and the kings of the earth represent the rulers of our world. So they control the leaders in our world, which would filter down to representatives and senators and Congress and all these. And Babylon the Great would get the captains, the armies, the navies, the air forces today, the sheriffs, the rulers, all gathered together on their team. Verse 3 says, the princes, the governors, the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, all the rulers were gathered together to the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And then Nebuchadnezzar did something. He just didn't say, all right, everybody, hit the deck. He didn't do that, did he? He used something. He said, I'm gonna play something, and as soon as you hear this sound, I want you to bow down. Now, Rodney, I think this connects with what you were saying this morning. Notice what he did. Verse 5. At what time you hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, dulcimer, and all kinds of music, you fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. So what did Nebuchadnezzar use to get people prepared and ready to bow down to his image? What did he use? He used music. That's right. Now, do you think this was reverent, sacred music? No. He used inappropriate music that had beat to it, that created, and that's what music that is not appropriate, it creates confusion in the mind because the beat is on the off syllable. It's called syncopation. There's two types of music in our world. There is a kind that brings reverence to God and good thoughts, and there is a kind of music that leads to immorality and wrong thoughts. There's two kinds of music. You know, it's interesting, over the years in talking with young people in school about music, They would say, "Oh, but Mr. Hughes, I only listen to the music that has good words. I only listen to the kind that says that we ought to love God." And I told them, I said, the words are not what matter. It's the music that matters most. Now, obviously, if you're listening to nice music and trash words, you don't want to listen to that either, right? But you can't listen to good words with a music that has beat to it. There's no such thing as Christian rock music. Do you realize that? Those two things are an antithesis to each other. You can't have it. There's no such thing. No such thing. We all like music. We are musical creatures. God made us with a love. We all love music. We all do. I don't know a person I have ever met who didn't like music. The question is, what kind of music are we listening to? And if it's a music that stirs us up, if it's a music that makes us want to get up and, if it makes you want to move, if it gives you thoughts that are not appropriate, that are not helping you as an individual, I don't care what the words are. If the music makes you want to move, it's not appropriate. It's not from heaven. Now, I don't believe that Nebuchadnezzar and why God put this in here was simply to say, watch out what kind of music you listen to. I think that's part of it. But folk, there's another aspect to this, and that is music is entertainment. Music is entertainment. It's a way that we spend time. And so I think a principle here is, what kind of things do we watch, do we listen to, or do we spend our time with as far as entertainment? Because you see here, folk, in Daniel chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar used entertainment, and in this case, music, for what purpose? To get the people's minds ready to do what? To worship God? No. They used it to get people's minds ready to bow down and worship a man. That's what Nebuchadnezzar did. Now, when I look back, and I'm not that old, I don't want anybody to say anything. There was a time when you could listen to something that was what somebody could say was harmless. Or you could watch something on television that was pretty harmless. I remember when I was young, and I'm aging myself now. Maybe I should go. No. Folk, I could watch something like Leave It to Beaver. Something like that. And folk, that just a family situation where two boys get involved in all kinds of crazy things and their parents try to pull them out at the last minute. But folk, it's all a process It's all a process. I remember back when I was growing up, the people I would listen to, like the Beatles and other rock groups, the Rolling Stones and the Carpenters and all these rock groups. And folk, it prepared me for one thing. It prepared me for disaster. That's what it prepared me for. To destroy me, to ruin my life. That's what it prepared me for. Nebuchadnezzar used entertainment. We have lived through in the last 50 years in this country and around the world, we have lived in an entertainment revolution. We have. You can't get around it. I remember 20 years ago when I visited in the Middle East for the first time when I went to Egypt. Folk, almost nobody, well, they had a television, but you couldn't see anything. It was all fuzz. Almost everybody in Egypt today has a nice television set, and you get a good picture. Why? Is Babylon the Great just trying to get people in America? Of course not. They're trying to get people all over the world. And they're using entertainment to do it. Christian music. Christian rock music, excuse me. So that's what was used to prepare the people to bow down to the image of the beast. And the warning was given that at what time you hear the music, you fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And whoever falleth not down, verse 6, and worshipeth, shall the same hour be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. Therefore at that time when all the people heard the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and all kinds of music, all the people, the nations, and the languages fell down and worshipped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. This was an act of worship. This was an act of loyalty to see who somebody was dedicated to, whether it was the God of heaven or the God of Babylon. Notice in Daniel chapter 3, the word worship or forms of that word are used several times. The word worship is used in verse 5. The word worshipeth is used in verse 6. The word worshipped is used in verse 7. The word worship is used again in verse 10. Worshipeth in verse 11. Worship in verse 12. Worship in verse 14. Twice the word worship is used in verse 15. And it's used again in verse 18, as well as in verse 28. The word worship or its forms is used 11 times in Daniel chapter 3. Do you know what other chapter in all the Bible uses the word worship more than any other? Revelation what? Which one? Not 17. No. No. Revelation chapter 13. Revelation chapter 13. Daniel chapter 3 uses that word 11 times. Revelation 13 uses it either 4 or 5 times. Those two chapters use it more than any other in all of the Bible. Now, the kind of worship that Nebuchadnezzar was demanding on the plains of Dura Was that true worship of the true God, or was it false worship of a false God? It was false worship of a false God. That's right. Now, because Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were in high positions in the kingdom of Babylon, were they aware of Nebuchadnezzar's plans to build this golden statue? Do you think they had any idea that it was going on? Of course. They knew about the gathering of the gold, where it was coming from. They knew about how the mold was being made somewhere out there, probably on the plains of Dura. They saw the gold brought, they saw it melted, they saw it put into this long statue, and the mold was created. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego watched as the entire process went on. Did they know there was going to be an issue over worship? They knew that, didn't they? And they knew that they would have to make a decision. They knew they would have to decide between what their God said in the Ten Commandments, or they would have to choose to fall down and worship this golden statue. So how did Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego prepare for this particular day? Day by day, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were spending time in prayer. And they were spending time memorizing Bible verses, because they knew that the only power that was greater than the power of Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon the Great, was the power of their God. So the music plays. Everybody on the plain of Dura put their face right in the sand. Everybody gets down. But a few of Nebuchadnezzar's right-hand men, as they get down with one hand, and they're looking. And they're looking at three particular people. You know who they're looking at? They were looking at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, because they had a sneaking suspicion that those three young men were not bowing down. Were they disappointed? No. Because as soon as they had hit the sand and they saw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, where'd they go? They went straight to Nebuchadnezzar. King! Everybody bowed down, but you know what? There's three young men that are in your court. They didn't listen to you. And what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about it? Verse 13 says, Nebuchadnezzar in his rage and fury commanded to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then they brought these men before the king. Babylon the Great and Nebuchadnezzar was furious. He was furious. Oh, by the way, for anybody who has gotten the idea lately that Pope Benedict XVI, because of all the nice pictures that you've been seeing and all the kind words that you've been reading about Benedict XVI, the new Pope, Joseph Ratzinger, don't fool yourself. You know what his nickname is? His nickname is the Grand Inquisitor. The Grand Inquisitor. Do you know what an inquisitor is? Inquisition is? The Inquisition is where you take people who don't do as you say, and you do anything and everything to them to let them know that you're not pleased. Now that's a nice way of saying that you hurt them very badly. So the present Pope who smiles and waves his hands is the Grand Inquisitor. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were brought before the Grand Inquisitor of Babylon the Great, whose name was Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar was not pleased. That's an understatement. Nebuchadnezzar was furious. Who do you think you are? You won't bow down and do what I tell you to do? And Nebuchadnezzar said, look, I'm going to give you another chance. I'm going to play the music again. And this time when you hear it, you better bow down or you're history. And at that point, with a lot of people watching, and Nebuchadnezzar surrounded by his guards and his captains and his soldiers, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego gave one of the greatest testimonies in the history of our planet. Daniel chapter 3, verse 17 and 18. The three men, the three Seventh-day Adventists who came face to face with Babylon the Great, said, Nebuchadnezzar, verse 16, O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer thee in this matter. If it be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. And he will deliver us out of thine hand, O king. But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. That has got to be one of the all-time great stands that were taken in defense of the God of heaven. The three young men said, if it be so, verse 17, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. Nebuchadnezzar, you can throw us in. You can try to burn us to a crisp. You can eliminate us from the face of the earth. But if our God says we live, we live. It doesn't matter what you try to do to us. If our God says no, you have no power over us. And then in verse 18, they said something equally dramatic. They said, but you know what? If our God lets us die, we still won't serve you. No matter what you try, no matter how hot you make it, we will never serve your gods. So the young men said, we know that our God can deliver. But if he decides for his glory to let us die, we will never serve your gods. Well, as you can imagine, Nebuchadnezzar was tickled about that response. Verse 19 says, Nebuchadnezzar was full of fury. The form of his visage, meaning his face, was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You know what that means? It means that demons took control of that man. he was furious that 3 young men would resist his authority. So what did Nebuchadnezzar do in his fury? Therefore he spake and commanded that they should heat the furnace 7 times more than it was wont to be heated. Now, can I ask a question here? Don't you think that the furnace, as it was, could have burned the young men to a crisp? I mean, a fire is a fire, isn't it? And if a fire is burning and you throw somebody on the fire, what's going to happen to them? They're going to burn. So why did Nebuchadnezzar heat it 7 times hotter? It doesn't make sense. A fire is a fire. In the writings of the Spirit of Prophecy, and I believe it's in Fourth Bible Commentary, commenting on Daniel chapter 3, the Spirit of Prophecy says that Nebuchadnezzar had a premonition in his mind that the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that God was going to deliver them. And because he had that premonition, Nebuchadnezzar tried to heat the furnace as hot as he possibly could, because he wanted to outdo the God of heaven. So he heated it 7 times hotter. You can imagine what Nebuchadnezzar was doing, ranting and raving, out of control, losing it. Heat the furnace! Get over here! Get these men and throw them in! He was furious. Verse 20, he commanded the most mighty men that were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and to cast them into the burning, fiery furnace. I can just picture in my mind those kind of mighty men. I remember one time I was in the U.S. Embassy in Cairo, and as I sat there, I put my feet up on a little table. And this was a rather volatile time. This was a few years after the Ayatollah had taken captive those Americans in the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, over in Iran. This was 5 years after that. So all the embassies in the Middle East had armed Marines or armed guards outside the compound and inside the compound. And they weren't messing around. I remember feeling very emaciated. I could barely eat when I went to Egypt the first time. They tried everything. I remember just sitting down, feeling exhausted in a little couch, and I put my feet up on a table that was right in front of me where they had magazines. When I put my feet on that table, I heard this sound. It said, "Get them off!" And I looked around. I looked around the room to see where the noise had come from. And I didn't have any idea where it came from. Well, there was a Marine over by the door. He was probably 6'6", probably weighed a good 240 pounds. The guy was a brute. He was a brute. And I kept my feet on the table because I didn't know who'd said it to me. And I kept my feet on the table, and I heard this loud sound again. It said, basically, get them off or you're out of here. Well, finally, I figured out that it was coming from that Marine. But he didn't move. He was like this. 6'6", 230, a brute. And I said, "Sir, are you talking to me?" He didn't move. He just said, "Yeah, get him off now." And I said, well, I didn't realize I was doing anything, but if that's how you feel about it, I'll move them. So I moved my feet. But folk, the men that stood around Nebuchadnezzar, these were big men. Big, strong, husky soldiers. The mightiest of men in his army. They grabbed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego with their coats, verse 21 says, their hose, their hats, their other garments, and they threw them into the furnace. And verse 22 tells us that somebody died, but it wasn't Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It says, because the king's commandment was urgent and the furnace exceeding hot, the flame of the fire slew those men that took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Why did it kill those mightiest of men, but it didn't hurt Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Those soldiers did not know of the God of heaven. They had no assurance of any protection whatsoever. And so they died. Verse 23, these three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down bound into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astonished. He was in shock and rose up in haste and spake and said to his counselors, did we not cast three men bound into the midst of the fire? They answered and said to the king, true, O king. Try in your mind to think for a moment what was going on with Nebuchadnezzar. The guy had been fury running over, beat, just, you know when somebody gets so mad that their eyes start bulging? Nebuchadnezzar was infuriated with these three young men. And then when he saw them walking in the fire, he couldn't believe it. Verse 25, he answered and said, lo, I see four men loose, walking in the midst of the fire. And they have no hurt, and the form of the fourth is like the Son of God. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego could walk in fire because Christ was there. Jesus delivered them. In the fire. Not from the fire, but in the fire. Jesus still walks in fire. He still walks in fire. Sometimes we look in our own lives and we are going through a trial and we read a story like this and we say, Lord, I've prayed that you would deliver me from this situation. Why don't you? And so we get mad because God hasn't delivered us. And we think that God doesn't answer us because we're still going through and still having to deal with something that's causing us pain. I would ask you this morning, what was the greatest deliverance that came? Was it walking in fire? Or was it the deliverance that God had given to 3 young men to be able to face the flames and say, we love our God so much, we'd rather die than hurt him? What was the greater deliverance? The latter. That's right. The greatest deliverance of all was to see that God could so free human beings from selfishness that they would rather die than do what was wrong. Lo, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt, and the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. The 3 young men had believed that Christ could set them free from fire. And he had. In closing this morning, I want to read one last verse. It's in Isaiah 43, verses 1 and 2. This was one of the many, many promises that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had memorized. And as they stared in the flame, they didn't see the flame, they saw this promise of God for them. Isaiah 43, verse 1 and 2. But now thus saith the Lord that created thee, O Jacob, and he that formed thee, O Israel, fear not, for I have redeemed thee. I have called thee by thy name. Thou art mine. When thou passest through the waters, I will be with thee. And through the rivers, they shall not overflow thee. When thou walkest through the fire, thou shalt not be burned, neither shall the flame kindle upon thee. My prayer for each one of us today is, as we face the fire, we'll look at God's promise instead of the flames. Let us pray. Dear Father in heaven, thank you that you walked in fire. Thank you that the fire had no power over those 3 young men. Thank you that you're still the same God today. Thank you that you can bring us deliverance in your time and in your way. And until you do, please help us to accept the greatest deliverance of all. Deliverance from our greatest enemy, ourselves. Bless us to see you and to depend on you and your promises to us. In Jesus' name.